Salesforce has recently become a prime target for cyber attacks. And we're here today with Tim West from WithSecure Threat Intelligence to unpack this through real-life observations, no theory, no hypotheticals. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Why do you think that these cyber criminals are suddenly so interested in Salesforce?
I think broadly because of the value of the data that's held within it. I think what's a really stark shift that we've seen in the industry over the last couple of years is a move from kind of ransomware actors, particularly in targeting kind of entire networks and trying to kind of painstakingly move through a network to deploy, an encryption tool to encrypt all the data, when they can achieve the same goal a much kind of quicker and more efficiently by targeting high value data, and Salesforce is packed with it.
So as like an entry point.
Yeah, well, it's also a really high value asset that organizations need to protect because of how sensitive the data is within Salesforce.
Yeah, and for operations, of course, as well. So many businesses run their most critical operational backbone on Salesforce.
But also, it's important to note that Salesforce is quite often deployed as a SaaS instance. Now, this means that the kind of entry point here is identity, and the battleground is around identity. And again, threat actors are starting to target identity more than anything else because of its efficiency in terms of compromising a wide swathe of organizations and victims without kind of too much effort and the impact that it causes. So Salesforce is such an attractive target because, if one threat actor has a set of credentials that they can purchase or identities that they've stolen, they can purchase or social engineer or phish, they can suddenly then target a huge number of organizations with kind of one fell swoop.
So in a sense, exploit the supply chain of both systems and organizations.
Yeah. And what's really important is because these are in kind of SaaS environments, they are essentially offshored from your network. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the kind of threat surface is also offshored. You are still responsible for the identities that are accessing that Salesforce, whether it's you or whether it's your service providers, and of course, sometimes that can get overlooked.
What's the biggest difference between these Salesforce attacks and other SaaS attacks that are like outside the network, and then on the other hand, on these like more network targeted attacks?
Well, I think what's quite important to note actually is there isn't an awful lot of difference between a Salesforce attack but also another SaaS service, because attackers don't really care. All they care about is whether there is a high concentration of sensitive data. Now, Salesforce is really attractive for that reason because there is such a high concentration. But if they have a lot of compromised identities, they can target, Salesforce and a host of other kind of SaaS services. With kind of on-premise attacks, threat actors are kind of moving away from this in the ransomware space. We see more and more. And the reason is because there's more opportunity for us to catch them, right? We have endpoint detection products, and we have kind of antivirus products and EPP products that we can use, and EDRs, I should say, actually, that we can use to detect their behavior on a network. Now, if Salesforce is off the network, we don't always have a product on Salesforce that we can use to detect.
Yes, so there's less visibility, there is no an inspection, at least on the same level as in the networks and in the endpoints. Like considering now this type of way that Salesforce, for example, is exploited, is this a new attacker playbook in your opinion or in your view?
It's not really, and I'll kind of explain why. I think one of the use cases I'd like to draw, or one of the threats maybe that we follow in WithSecure and of course, every other cybersecurity company, frankly, particularly in the UK at the moment, is Scattered Spider. Now, they are particularly prominent in the public consciousness in the UK at the moment because they were the ones reported to be behind the attacks on Marks and Spencer and Co-op food, which has been a kind of a really visible sign of the impact that could come from a compromise of a computer network. Now, there are differences, and in these cases, the threat actor known as Scattered Spider thought they weren't compromising Salesforce per se, but the techniques and tactics that they employed when compromising Marks and Spencer's and Co-op are techniques and tactics employed by threat actors that probably overlap with Scattered Spider to a big extent, that do target Salesforce. And this is kind of targeting humans and the individuals who run the systems.
In a way, exploit the human error there. So
It's worth kind of noting that the human error is always, or almost always, the biggest weak link in any kind of cybersecurity environment.
yeah, and it probably cannot be fully mitigated by any technology, but it can still be minimized.
Yeah, belt and braces approach, we say.
Yeah.
You want the user education as well as the kind of technology on the endpoints.
You have previously described Salesforce as high trust, high value, and low effort target for cyber attackers. So could you perhaps expand on that conclusion a little bit?
So if you're a ransomware actor and you want to extract kind of a large ransom from an organization, right, there are certain levers you can pull. Now, the traditional lever was encrypting an entire network. And then they moved on to kind of multi-factor kind of ransom levers. And the second factor they used was data theft. And actually organizations, and certainly large organizations, have an obligation to protect their customers' data. They could be liable for kind of fines or anything like that if they don't kind of comply. And that's a lever that the threat actors are now pulling. So it takes them a lot of time and effort to compromise an entire network to launch an encryption tool. And it doesn't take them as much time and effort to utilize a stolen identity or username and password to log in and exfiltrate that way, or socially engineer somebody to perform a task that they shouldn't do that enables the attack, like having a connected app, for example. So with that in mind, it suddenly becomes a really kind of low risk and high return for a threat actor. Instead of spending a lot of time on one organization, to spend a little time on loads with, a few kind of bits of compromised identity or targeting concentration points in a supply chain, and suddenly they have the same lever, right? They can still kind of pull the extortion lever with the volume of sensitive data they've got. They no longer need to compromise and encrypt as much of a network.
The headlines pretty much tell the story. So there have been major UK retailers, Coca-Cola, breached by leveraging Salesforce in one way or another. As you've been following these cases really closely, what has specifically stood out to you in these UK retailer hacks?
Yeah, well, it's been really successful and it's been really prominent in the UK news and media. And if you've got an interest in cybersecurity and you're based in the UK, you will have seen it. It's being discussed at kind of governmental levels, which is pretty rare actually for a cyber attack. And this kind of shows the level of impact this has had, not just kind of physically, but also psychologically on the public. Now, what's really interesting to me is Google recently released a report around threat actors whose TTPs, so kind of tactics, techniques, and procedures, almost directly overlap with the group that's been attributed to the Marks and Spencer's breach. And in their attacks, what they are doing is essentially vishing or voice phishing, socially engineering people with privilege on Salesforce accounts and convincing them to add a malicious app that masquerades as a legitimate Salesforce app. So what is really kind of striking to me is, possibly the same actors, but if not at least huge overlap with the same actors, that is causing such a stir in the UK, are deliberately and definitively targeting Salesforce and organizations' Salesforce instances. So there's a huge risk.
That's really interesting. And somehow, at least for me, that brings back this fact that sometimes in these SaaS platforms such as Salesforce, there can be quite wide access privileges for users, like way beyond what might be required. And then it becomes quite easy if you do have access to that users.
But I think you're right. So not only does Salesforce contain a kind of a wealth of sensitive information that companies are obliged to protect, but also it's ingrained and inbuilt and baked into a lot of kind of other systems and processes from around an organization. So not only is it a viable vector to access kind of data stored in other parts or systems around a network, but also you have to kind of consider, if you're a CISO or a resilience officer in an organization, you have to kind of consider the business interruption of containing that incident in your Salesforce. If you then kind of turn off Salesforce access in an effort to contain the intrusion, suddenly your business operations ground to a halt, and you've got a lot of stakeholders angrily banging on your door.
So it's pretty much that visibility is key, and it's kind of worth worth the investment and worth the effort to have that.
For sure. Like, kind of prevention is much cheaper than remediation, that's for sure. And we actually saw this in a couple of use cases. So the first, let me just refer to the Marks and Spencer's attack. Right, they took action to segregate their own network after the attack, and that's, we think, what caused a lot of the interruption. And the same thing happened in 2023 with Colonial Pipeline in the United States. Now, this is a major oil and gas pipeline. This underpins a lot of the US economy, or their kind of energy economy at least. And they took their payment system offline deliberately to contain a cyber attack, and that's what stopped the gas flowing. It wasn't the cyber attack themselves that stopped the service, it was the action taken by, and the correct action, I should say, but there is a huge impact.
Yeah, exactly. Like sometimes you're just forced to make these decisions. Yeah, we have actually seen that in our customer base as well. So for WithSecure Cloud Protection for Salesforce, there are enterprises who, simply because they have lacked the visibility into Salesforce and they have had a security incident and there has been a suspicion that it has come from Salesforce, they have had to shut down their entire Salesforce instance for days, simply because they don't know what has happened, where it has come from, and there is no ability to really investigate inside Salesforce. So then the only option literally is to shut everything down to be able to contain it. And that's expensive and really, really, really damaging also for business operations.
And brand.
And all the trust of customers and stakeholders.
And the more that Salesforce is kind of integrated within all the business processes, the more impactful that is. But also, if you're operating this as a SaaS service and provision, it's exposed to the internet, and therefore attackers will be seeking to target it.
Is there something unique about this Scattered Spiders playbook?
Scattered Spider is an interesting case in that it kind of refers to a relatively decentralized group of individuals. Sometimes they are thought to be US, UK based. Quite often they are referred to as teenagers. And this is significant because they're not employing kind of highly advanced, technical attacks. They are capable of causing great damage from just a social engineering approach to and relatively kind of rudimental techniques towards people with high levels of privilege. So help desk support. Now maybe they are outsourced, for example. Maybe they are outsourced in a country where there's a language barrier, for example. Or they are outsourced to an organization or geographical sector where there's a different kind of culture around cybersecurity and training, and they take advantage of these kind of human levers as opposed to the technological ones, and they do it with staggering success. These are the group that's kind of been reported to have taken down the MGM Group hotels in Vegas as well. So really high profile.
So you just said that there are teenagers members of these types of groups. Any thoughts?
We think I can't speak to the identities of the people behind these kind of attacks, whether it be the Salesforce or the Marks and Spencers and Co-op attacks, because I just don't know them. But there are kind of suggestions and commentators that would say, yeah, these are teenagers. I think sometimes it's more of a synonym for kind of unsophisticated and more kind of rudimental from a technological perspective.
For example, the tactics and techniques that the Scattered Spider has been leveraging, do you think that we should be expecting more attacks of these types also from other groups?
Yeah, absolutely. Success begets kind of success in that sense. Now, if Salesforce is what it is, Salesforce is a kind of really popular and viable entry point into a network for the reasons that we've mentioned earlier. High quality data integrated with a lot of business services, so it's a really high value asset for an organization. If that is being managed by a human, which most systems are, then it'll be targeted.
Any comments on the sophisticated attacks versus then these more simple attacks applied by these less organized cybercrime groups?
Just because it's not sophisticated doesn't mean it's not as effective. Now, why would you break in as a cyber kind of attacker if you can simply log in with some credentials that you've purchased for a couple of euros? And remember, the threats and the actors will do the minimum they require to get access. They don't need to overkill. While more kind of simple attack approaches and vectors, such as social engineering, are viable, they'll continue to use them.
So the threat is real and the price is high with these Salesforce attacks, as has been seen in these recent real-world incidents. What would your advice, Tim, be to people who are responsible for Salesforce security, whether through Salesforce-specific roles or security leaders?
So make sure your hygiene's in place first and foremost. Now, it's really important that you need some kind of security on the SaaS service itself. Don't assume it happens by somebody else. You need to be responsible. So look for kind of Salesforce security products. Make sure you have some kind of protection on there so you can audit who is accessing the data, who needs to access the data, why, but critically as well, make sure you can respond if somebody unauthorized has manages to get access to the data. Also kind of be aware of the malicious elements that may be within your kind of Salesforce or any other SaaS service instance for that matter. Inspect the links, and also make sure you've got robust kind of plans for what happens if, or being cynical, put cynically, when threat actors may choose to target your Salesforce instance.
Yeah, so being aware of the shared responsibility model in the cloud services, where these cloud vendors do cover certain elements of security in the infrastructure side, for example, but then at the end of the day, it's the organization who is using these cloud platforms' responsibility to actually secure the data in there. So for example, in case of Salesforce, that means the responsibility to inspect all incoming and outgoing data for any malicious elements like malware or phishing links, for example.
Absolutely. And just be aware that it probably will be a target, right? Either opportunistically or deliberately. There are a lot of threat actors out there that are actively seeking to compromise Salesforce instances and similar SaaS services.
What's the one thing that organizations often overlook in Salesforce and other cloud platform security?
Well, I think I'll speak kind of more generally on kind of cloud platforms, but there is an identity element in almost every attack we see on SaaS services. Whether that's a Salesforce compromise or a business email compromise, there is always an element of this. Quite often as well, there is not multi-factor authentication enabled. I wouldn't assume that the defaults, and they may be, and that's great if they are, but don't assume that the defaults are set to be the highest kind of level of security that you need as an organization. So do your checking, do your testing, make sure multi-factor authentication is turned on, and get the basics right. Be kind of cyber hygienic in that sense.
So now, Tim, what would be your key takeaways for securing Salesforce in 2025, especially based on these recent attacks that we have seen?
There are really successful actors out there who are deliberately targeting Salesforce, and they will do so from targeting the humans. So make sure that your humans are trained and aware and ready to respond in such an event, but also don't expect it to happen, and make sure you've got a kind of failback and a technological solution to enable you to react as quickly as possible. In our kind of lingo, we kind of call this shift left. So make sure we are detecting and taking action as soon as possible, and make sure you're ready to do that, with robust technology and processes as well.
Attackers are adapting faster than the defenses, but on Salesforce, there luckily are ways to mitigate these risks with real-time control and visibility. So tools like WithSecure Cloud Protection for Salesforce offer real-time protection against malicious content like malware and phishing, and soon also for credential compromises of both internal and external Salesforce users. So the threat is real. The threat actors today are deliberately targeting Salesforce, and the risks are really high. The impact of doing nothing can cost a lot for business operations, customer trust, data loss, and it simply cannot be ignored. So doing nothing is not really an option.